For decades, Diane Lane perfected the art of appearing untouched by scandal. On screen, she embodied grace, desire, and quiet strength. Off-screen, she learned how to survive a Hollywood that demanded beauty, obedience, and silence at the same time. Behind the red carpets and flashing cameras, there were relationships no one was supposed to know about, romances that crossed dangerous lines, and betrayals that left scars far deeper than the public ever imagined. While audiences admired her timeless elegance, rumors followed her like a shadow, whispered in casting rooms, hotel corridors, and behind studio doors. This is not the story Hollywood told about Diane Lane. This is the story of the love affairs, emotional battles, and private choices that shaped her life far away from the spotlight. And why? Only now, the truth can finally be spoken. But Diane Lane stayed silent for decades. She learned early that survival in Hollywood often depends on what you don't say. Now, at 60, she is choosing honesty over illusion, truth over preservation. For the first time, she is no longer protecting an image. She is confronting it. In this story, we step behind the polished surface and into the relationships that reshaped her life, affairs fueled by passion, secrecy, imbalance, and emotional cost. These were not tabloid romances or fleeting flirtations. They were defining moments that left permanent marks. Hollywood never wanted these stories told because they disrupt the fantasy. And once you hear them, it becomes impossible to look at Diane Lane the same way again. Diane Colleen Lane was born on January 22, 1965, in New York City, into a world where performance was not a choice, but an atmosphere. Her mother, Colleen Farrington, was a nightclub singer and model who lived for attention and escape. Her father, Burton Lane, was a drama coach who loved theater more than stability, scraping by as a cab driver to keep his artistic dreams alive. From the outside, their life hinted at glamour. Inside the home, it was chaos. Love clashed with ambition. Arguments replaced routine. And before Diane could understand what safety meant, her parents' marriage collapsed. Custody went to her father, heir at the time, and Diane's childhood became nomadic and uncertain. They lived in small, cramped spaces, often above the same theater where Burton taught acting. There were no quiet mornings, no sense of permanence, only scripts, rehearsals, and constant movement. Diane loved her father deeply. He was her protector, her teacher, and her gateway into acting. But beneath that devotion lived a quiet longing for normalcy, for grounding, for something whole that never seemed to last. Her mother remained a distant presence, drifting in and out of Diane's life from Georgia, chasing her own version of fulfillment. That fragile balance shattered when Diane was just 13 years old. Without warning, her mother took her south. The move was abrupt, disorienting, and emotionally jarring. Diane felt uprooted, stripped of control, and placed in a life that didn't feel like hers. 1 year later, at just 14, she made a decision that revealed the core of her resilience. She ran back to New York alone. No safety net, no certainty, just instinct and resolve. It was the first time she chose herself, and it wouldn't be the last time survival required that strength. By age 6, Diane was already under stage lights, performing in theater productions with a confidence that didn't feel rehearsed. Even then, she possessed a stillness, a gravity that pulled attention without effort. This wasn't childhood imitation, it was identity. Acting wasn't something she played at, it was something she inhabited. That truth became undeniable when, at just 13, she was cast in A Little Romance, sharing the screen with Laurence Olivier. For most teenagers, the moment would have been crushing. Diane met it with composure beyond her years. Critics were stunned. Her poise, emotional intelligence, and natural elegance felt unmanufactured, almost unsettling in someone so young. Overnight, she was labeled cinema's next great promise. Hollywood noticed and closed in. The 1980s sealed her rise. She moved through defining films of the era with quiet authority, holding her own among rising legends. In The Outsiders and Rumblefish, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, she didn't fade into the ensemble. As Cherry Valance, she embodied longing, restraint, and emotional depth. In Coppola's darker follow-up, she revealed a seriousness that separated her from the standard teen star narrative. Then came Streets of Fire, where she shattered expectations, again commanding the screen with strength, vulnerability, and a presence that could not be ignored. What the audience didn't see was the cost of growing up admired, desired, and scrutinized before she had the tools to protect herself. Fame arrived before boundaries, power imbalances formed before experience, and the emotional patterns shaped in childhood instability. Longing silence followed her into adulthood. The stage was set not just for success, but for relationships that would blur lines, test limits, and leave scars. She spent decades learning how to carry. Diane Lane, youthful, radiant, and seemingly unstoppable, was everywhere. However, Hollywood's loyalty is brittle. Her momentum was stalled by a series of box office setbacks, and she was forgotten as soon as she had been hailed. It was a tough change. Diane discreetly took a step back and re-evaluated a profession that had expanded more quickly than she had. She reappeared in the 1990s and early 2000s as a woman who had shaped herself, not the girl Hollywood had once molded her into. clarity, and a second act that felt well-deserved came with maturity. This time she was once more in the spotlight. A Walk on the Moon, released in 1999, marked Diane Lane's modest comeback. She played a restless housewife during the Woodstock summer, eloquently expressing emotional hunger, bewilderment, and longing. Audiences were reminded that her ability has only grown stronger over time by the intimate and courageous presentation. Although it was a turning point, her legacy would not be defined by it. Unfaithful in 2002 marked that turning point. Diane gave a performance devoid of pretension and vanity as a woman caught between desire and commitment. Every look, every pause was significant. She was nominated for an Academy Award for the portrayal, which made her one of the most admired actors of her generation. It was deemed exceptional by critics. The truth she displayed on TV felt uncomfortably close to the audience. Rekindled fame was accompanied by insatiable curiosity. Whispers were raised by her emotional authenticity. How could she make emotion appear so genuine? In the public's mind, the distinction between performance and private life became hazy. Questions grew, rumors spread, and all of a sudden Diane Lane was not only respected for her profession, she was analyzed, discussed, and thrust into a limelight that required more than just skill. Confession was required. There was a more subdued query hidden below the praise and outrage. Was the adored leading lady of America really well known? Or had she never showed the world anything but the portion she wanted them to see? As the camera followed Diane Lane, so did love, celebrity, and scrutiny. Her brilliance wasn't the only reason she was admired. She was one of Hollywood's most sought-after women due to her timeless beauty and subdued charm. From the time she became well-known, the audience was captivated by her private life as much as her performances. Every romance, heartache, and rumor that was spoken about her was incorporated into the narrative that others attempted to build about her. Since I grew up in the entertainment business, romance was a common occurrence. Diane was surrounded by charming, aspirational men who were all vying for the same attention. Actor Christopher Lambert was one of her first well-known partners. A romance that burns bright but fleetingly. Their bond was instantaneous and powerful. Careers eventually pulled them in opposite directions, and what began with promise thinned into distance. The connection didn't explode or collapse in scandal, it simply eroded, quietly, the way many Hollywood romances do. Yet the bond never fully disappeared. It lingered, resurfacing later in unexpected ways. Proof that some relationships don't end cleanly, they just change shape. Around the same period, Diane was linked to other high-profile actors at the height of their fame, including Timothy Hutton. That relationship burned intensely but proved fragile. Strained by relentless schedules, long separations, and the emotional cost of living under constant observation. In Hollywood, love rarely exists in private, and theirs was no exception. As Diane's public image solidified into one of elegance, restraint, and composure, fascination grew around what she didn't say. Silence became a canvas for speculation. Tabloids fed on rumors of secret affairs and hidden relationships, eager to fracture the illusion of perfection. Whether exaggerated or rooted in truth, the whispers followed her everywhere. She became a paradox, visible everywhere, yet personally unknowable. In an industry that confuses intimacy with spectacle, Diane Lane evolved into a symbol of both desire and mystery, celebrated and dissected endlessly, even when she offered nothing to dissect at all. Her first true heartbreak came not from rumor, but from the collapse of something that once felt like fate. After a brief romance in the 1980s, Diane reconnected with Christopher Lambert years later, and this time it felt different. Certain grounded, they married, welcomed a daughter, Eleanor, and for a moment Diane appeared to have achieved what had always eluded her: a stable family alongside a thriving career. It was the life she had quietly chased since childhood, but the happiness was fragile, constantly tested by distance, grueling schedules, and the unforgiving pressure of two international careers, colliding under public scrutiny. Love alone could not protect what exhaustion slowly wore down. In 1994, after 6 years of marriage, they divorced. The separation cut deeper than she ever admitted publicly. It wasn't just the loss of a partner, it was the shattering of stability she had fought to give her daughter, the very stability she herself never had growing up. The divorce felt like history repeating itself, and Diane carried that sense of failure in silence, refusing to turn personal pain into public theater. That chapter changed her permanently. Diane became fiercely protective of her private life, choosing restraint over exposure, quiet over explanation. She never abandoned the idea of love, but she became far more selective about who she allowed into her inner world. Fame had taught her a brutal lesson. Hollywood rarely allows relationships to exist without interference. Publicists, studio expectations, and tabloid narratives didn't just report love stories, they shaped them. Who she dated, how she appeared, what image she was expected to project, all of it was negotiated territory. Over time, the constant scrutiny made trust nearly impossible. Was affection genuine, or simply proximity to attention? Was intimacy real, or another role being performed? Eventually, Diane stepped back from public romance altogether. She redirected her energy toward her work, her daughter, and the slow rebuilding of her own sense of peace. She refused to chase love on terms written by anyone else. And yet, even in retreat, one truth remained: her story was never about scandal. It was about survival, restraint, and the quiet cost of loving in a world that never stops watching. Love has a way of returning when defenses finally fall, often at the moment a person stops searching for it. After years devoted to healing and raising her daughter, Diane Lane allowed herself to open her heart again in the early 2000s. She found that connection with Josh Brolin, whose intensity, confidence, and emotional depth seemed to meet her at the same level. Their bond ignited quickly and publicly, leading to marriage in 2004 and a renewed belief that lasting happiness might still be possible. For a time, it felt like a new beginning, earned intentional and grounded in maturity rather than illusion. But old wounds do not disappear simply because love arrives. Personal struggles, emotional history, and the pressure of living under constant observation slowly weighed on their marriage. When they divorced in 2013, the pain was real, but Diane met it differently than before. There was no public unraveling, no bitterness played out for cameras. Instead, she chose resilience over regret, stepping forward quietly and reclaiming her life on her own terms. It was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was about survival with dignity intact. Hollywood's fascination with Diane Lane has always blurred the line between truth and temptation, transforming her private life into a kind of mythology. Some relationships were real, some exaggerated, and others entirely imagined, born from the emotional honesty she brought to the screen. Together, they created an image that followed her for decades, whether she participated in it or not. One of the most defining chapters was her relationship with Christopher Lambert. What began as a connection in the mid-1980s eventually grew into marriage, a shared home, and the birth of their daughter. For a while it looked like the life she had always wanted: steady, loving, and whole. Yet even that stability proved fragile beneath the strain of distance, ambition, and relentless public attention. By the mid-1990s, the marriage ended, leaving Diane once again confronting the reality that love, especially in Hollywood, is rarely protected from external pressure. Her later marriage to Josh Brolin carried its own storm. Their connection was deeply emotional and undeniably intense, but it unfolded under a magnifying glass. Early in the marriage, a highly publicized domestic incident shocked the industry. Diane later downplayed it, choosing not to define her life by a single moment, but the damage to public perception lingered. Despite efforts to move forward, the marriage could never fully escape its shadow, and nearly a decade later it quietly ended. It was another reminder that passion, when mixed with fame, often extracts a heavy cost. Professional chemistry only fueled further speculation. Diane's unforgettable performance opposite a co-star and Unfaithful sparked rumors of an off-screen romance, which she consistently dismissed as the product of trust and artistic connection rather than personal involvement. Similar whispers followed other intense collaborations, where emotional realism convinced audiences that something more must exist beyond the frame. Diane was always clear in her response. Respect for the craft, not romance, was the foundation of those performances. Earlier in her career, youthful relationships did quietly unfold behind the scenes, brief, tender connections with fellow young actors that she later remembered with warmth rather than drama. Other rumored affairs with musicians, directors, and co-stars were largely inventions of tabloid imagination, repeated often enough to feel real, but rarely grounded in truth. Even decades later, fascination with her private life never fully faded. Occasional playful admissions from co-stars about longtime crushes reminded audiences of her enduring allure. Yet Diane never leaned into scandal or used it for attention. She chose discretion, correcting the record only when necessary, always with calm clarity. In the end, the so-called scandals reveal far less about Diane Lane than they do about Hollywood's endless hunger for drama. Behind every rumor was a woman navigating love, work, loss, and survival in an industry that never stopped watching. Media attention followed her for most of her life, often turning deeply personal moments into public spectacle. Incidents from her marriages, especially during her relationship with Josh Brolin, were amplified far beyond their reality, leaving impressions that lingered long after the truth had been quietly addressed. Diane learned early that once a story enters the public arena, it no longer belongs to the person living it. Rather than fight the noise, she chose distance. In interviews, she consistently redirected attention away from her personal life, choosing instead to speak about her work, her craft, and the inner lives of the characters she portrayed. That restraint became her shield. By refusing to turn pain into performance, she preserved something rare in Hollywood: a sense of privacy, control, and self. And in doing so, Diane Lane quietly reclaimed her story, not as a scandalous figure, but as a woman who loved deeply, endured publicly, and survived on her own terms. Privacy, for Diane, was never about secrecy. It was about survival. In an industry that feeds on exposure, she learned early that protecting herself was the only way to endure. Looking ahead, her focus never drifted far from growth. She chose roles that demanded emotional truth and artistic integrity rather than chasing trends, headlines, or validation. And when she did speak, her words were measured, intentional, and rooted in dignity, never defensiveness. Silence, when she chose it, was not avoidance, it was strength. Navigating fame with grace and self-awareness became her quiet armor. Those qualities carried her through the moments when scrutiny grew loudest and judgment came fastest. Diane Lane's life reads like a quiet rebellion against expectation. From a fractured childhood to international stardom, she moved through heartbreak, reinvention, and relentless observation without losing her sense of self. Rumors rose and fell, scandals flared and disappeared. Through it all, she refused to let speculation define her, allowing her work, not whispers, to shape her legacy. Now in her 60s, Diane stands as something rare in Hollywood, a symbol of resilience, independence, and self-possession in an industry that rarely permits any of the three. Her understanding of love has evolved with time. The fairy tale endings once promised by Hollywood no longer hold power over her. She sees love as complex and imperfect, sometimes fleeting, sometimes painful, but always meaningful. Its value, she believes, lies not in permanence, but in honesty, depth, and the courage to feel fully. She has loved deeply, lost profoundly, and grown stronger because of it. Today, fulfillment comes on her own terms. It lives in meaningful work, in motherhood, and in the peace that comes from no longer needing to prove anything to anyone. Questions about her romantic past still surface, met sometimes with quiet humor, more often with silence. That mystery only deepens her presence rather than diminishing it. New rumors may always emerge, Hollywood depends on them, but one truth remains unchanged. Diane Lane's grace, talent, and timeless presence have endured for decades, and they show no sign of fading.